A business group in Ontario wants to see more people enjoy the province's heritage buildings and main streets. The Ontario Business Improvement Area Association is bringing together urban planners, people with disabilities, and business owners to remove barriers in these spaces. Kay Matthews is the executive director of the Ontario BIAA Association. Kay, hello.
Good morning.
What are people with disabilities telling you about the accessibility of heritage buildings and main streets across the province?
They're wanting to make them as accessible as possible. And this is when we have so many of our main streets across the province of Ontario that were built. So many of the buildings are possibly more than 100 years old, long before any accommodations were made towards people with disabilities. What we're trying to do is just make sure that our main streets are as accessible as possible to as many people as possible.
What are some of the biggest accessibility issues that are coming up in these conversations and that you're seeing amongst these buildings and on main streets?
I think it's really the fact that they pre-existed before many of the changes have come in across the province, such as the OBIAA, which is the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and that is really bringing and drawing awareness to the need for accessibility. But listen, our main streets are incredibly accessible in many, many ways because they're very walkable. So you can live near a main street and walk into town. You can, bicycle, take your wheelchair. You can. I've often watched somebody with a stick that helps them guide their way. So there are many, many ways of getting to main streets, but it's actually accessing some of the buildings within main streets that becomes a challenge because, as I mentioned, they predate things like the OBIAA, which is a wonderful act that is trying to help all people access these buildings. So there may be 2 steps up to a bakery, or it may be a challenge to actually see or hear some of the aspects of getting into these buildings. Many of these buildings, of course, and many of our main streets are built near waterways. We originally started from mill towns or other reasons for the main street to be built. And therefore, we're trying to find and start a dialogue on how we can make these changes to many of the older buildings. Maybe they're not necessarily designated heritage buildings, but they may have an ambulatory issue or maybe a disability issue that makes it a little bit more difficult for somebody with a disability to access them. Simple things that can be done, such as putting a doorbell on the front of a storefront. But even more, there's a lot more aspects to it. In that there are, under the OBIAA, there's different compliance that needs to come in. And some of these heritage buildings will never be able to have a ramp because they don't have enough space in front of the sidewalk. They possibly don't have some sort of access to a second floor, such as an elevator. So we're trying to start that dialogue and try to break down the barriers between often the property owner, who really could or should be making some of the retrofits to the building, but the tenant, who is the business, doesn't have the funds to actually do that high level of investment in order to break down those barriers. So it's trying to get to that yes. How do we get to that yes and have that property owner make the investment so that the business owner can serve their customers even better?
And I know it's early days in this dialogue that you've created, but how do you get to that yes? What's your sense of what actions need to be taken to make buildings more accessible?
Well, there's many actions that can be taken. And as you mentioned, we do have a style guide that we created a couple of years ago with the help of the Ministry for Seniors and Accessibility. That's right. And we have that, and we try to get that into as many hands as possible for the business owners and the property owners across the province of Ontario. But it really begins with a dialogue. And so we're really blessed. Not only are we having a conference on October 20th that's going to bring together all of the groups that you formerly mentioned to begin that dialogue, but we've also created a crossover event with the National Trust for Canada, which is a heritage group that helps to, in many cases, preserve heritage buildings. But they're also having a conference at the same time that our Ontario BIAs are having a conference. And so we're having a session during both of our conferences that all delegates at both conferences will be a part of. And it's that idea about getting to yes. How do we encourage the property owners, the business owners, and people across the province to understand that by doing that investment in that heritage building, it is making Ontario more accessible to far more people.
Kay, it's been great talking to you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Kay Matthews is the Executive Director of the Ontario BIA Association.